Freedom is a pure idea. It occurs spontaneously and without instruction.
See what the Empire has done to your lives? Your families and your freedom?
Good people will fight if we lead them.
The rebellion is spreading.
Now we take the war to them.
The Republic will be reorganized.
Systems either change or die.
Into the first.
You give way to an enemy this evil with this much power, and you condemn the galaxy to an eternity of submission.
And wake up. There is one way. Now fighting from the start.
Long live the Empire!
Fight the Empire!
Let's call it war.
Remember this. Try.
Hey, Sophie.
Hey, Eleanor.
You sound so sick.
I am sorry. I'm not that sick today. I'm way better than yesterday.
You sound sick, and that's what matters on a podcast. Your eyes are watery. You look just
my eyes. Well, I'll tell you what. My eyes are not watery because I'm sick. My eyes are watery because I accidentally squirted conditioner into them this morning when I was in the shower.
You've still... Okay.
My conditioner is not, like, family friendly.
Do you use, like, carpet conditioner or something?
Pretty much.
You just need some slightly more expensive hair care products.
Boo, money is for losers. This is why I took a job that pays me less overall than my current job.
I'm unemployed. Sorry that I spend time making this shitty
contributing to
ass
capitalism, and I am offended by this.
I am, in that I'm doing free promo for the Walt Disney Corporation. I'm giving to capitalism out of the goodness of my heart. Okay, you know the guy, the pale, like, tan-skinned guy, he says Tiwanawanga. What's that guy's name?
Bib Fortuna.
That guy, he goes through a lot. So he's on Jabba's sail barge, and it explodes, and he survives that. His employer is dead. He tries to maintain Jabba's criminal empire with, like, no remaining infrastructure, and then he gets shot on the throne by Boba Fett.
Largely regarded as a dick move.
They really should call him Bib Unfortuna.
Miss Fortuna? Yeah.
Miss Fortuna is
That's his drag,
better. God damn it.
Drag
Shit.
name, and also Miss Fortuna.
Lawfully wedded. So, once upon a time in 2012, Fantasy Flight Games released Star Wars X-Wing miniatures. We're starting off strong.
Star Wars X-Wing miniatures. And what exactly does this have to do with crime?
We're getting there.
Okay.
In X-Wing miniatures, you as the player control physical model starships. You're playing as starfighters on a tabletop, and you typically engage in simulated dogfights against another player. It's really cool, I swear. It's not for losers.
Parentheses, this game is for losers, close parentheses.
Every starfighter has a pilot to distinguish it from other starfighters of its same model, and every assigned pilot has a team. These teams, or their factions, most of these sorts of Star Wars tabletop games name them, are integral because it dictates what starfighters you should and shouldn't explode. There are 7 factions a ship can fall under in X-Wing miniatures. 6 of them are the main political factions: Republic Separatist, Imperial Rebel, Resistance First Order. And the 7th one is called Scum and Villainy.
That's a great name. I want to be part of Scum and Villainy.
So Scum and Villainy is comprised of people from the underworld, I guess, non-military, non-political entities from all across Star Wars' ever-present crime element. This idea of the Star Wars Scum and Villainy is a key visual element in A New Hope. From the moment Obi-Wan uses the term to describe Mos Eisley, right? He's like, look at that fucking place.
This is...
Why did they go to Mos Eisley and not, like, Mos Espa, you know?
Because
is Mos Espa better?
No, they needed crime, right?
That's true, they needed duplicitous assholes.
Duplicitous assholes
Yeah.
to get them off planet because they were being hunted by the evil fascist galactic overlords and such.
Those scenes in the cantina, they're as iconic as the rest of the film. They're included to show off the seedy underbelly of this new world. We're introduced to all sorts of brand new alien beings, which add texture and exotic, slightly dangerous depth to Star Wars in a way that the political landscape of a consular ship can't really do.
Yeah, the guy playing the fake saxophone really adds an element of danger.
The fake saxophone is the most important part of Star Wars that Disney will never understand. We've seen this side of Star Wars pop up time and time again. In Empire, we get to see Boba Fett. In Attack of the Clones, we see the neon-lit Outlander nightclub as a hotbed of gambling, illicit trade, that Death Sticks guy.
That is really, like, terrible marketing on that drug. Imagine if, like, fentanyl was, like, death pills, right? Like, who would buy that?
I think Death Sticks is crack. It varies, but I think Death Sticks is crack. Death Sticks is crack. That probably won't be the episode title, but it could be. In The Force Awakens, we see Maz Kanata. She is the pirate queen. We've got books and comics devoted to seedy characters getting up to shenanigans. We've got a fucking game coming out next year called Outlaws. This is an ever-present feature of Star Wars. In X-Wing, the Scum and Villainy faction is a sometimes literal motley crew. It has bounty hunters, smugglers, assassins, members of syndicates, pirates, and even just Mandalorians. It's just got a bunch of Mandalorians because I guess they fall into that camp. They have nowhere else to go. But what sets the members of the underworld apart from, like, Luke's fucking aunt on Tatooine? What is the difference? There's one obvious element that sets them apart, and that is the law.
Turns out when you break the law, you become a criminal. Like me every day when I jaywalk across the street.
Real hardened crime over here. But yeah, the way we're supposed to see these guys is as criminals. They smuggle, they steal, they shoot, and ask questions never. But is that always true? Criminalization is the process by which individuals become criminals and behaviors become crimes. You might think that a criminal is made when an individual breaks the law, but that's not quite it. The law is obviously not a fixed or natural institution. It varies between polities, it changes over time, and additionally, there are plenty of entities that break the law that aren't considered criminal. By the time of the prequels, slavery, sentient beings traded and used as property, is nominally illegal in the Republic. Slavery is considered to be a brutal and morally repugnant practice. It was still widely performed unchallenged in some places outside of Republic jurisdiction, much like the United States, which has made slavery illegal, but we benefit from it.
Export it a little bit.
Even though you could say maybe the Republic could exercise a bit more of its political influence to encourage non-member territories not to do slavery, etc., etc., the point is, at least, that a syndicate trafficker couldn't do their shit on Coruscant without fear of getting got by the robot cops. But what if I told you that full-on slavery does exist on Republic core worlds during the prequels, and that the Republic just kind of looks the other way?
I really don't like that. I feel like I'm going to like it even less after you tell me about it.
The Circa Corporation is an arms dealer. Old.
So we have the Republic military-industrial complex doing slavery.
I will clarify. I did my best. I did not see any instances of the Republic using Circa arms in canon.
Interesting.
I looked. It's all other shit. It's Incom, it's blast tech. Circa essentially just makes shit that, like, bounty hunters and stuff use, frankly. That's when Circa is brought up. There is definitely a profit incentive for the Republic, but the Republic's own warmongering does not seem to include Circa that we know of. That's my caveat.
That's nice. The Republic is not directly using slavery to fund its war effort.
Well.
Directly.
Clones.
Oh, shit.
Circa is old, and Circa is powerful. It makes wide use of slave labor in its manufacturing, mining, and other processes. All slaves marked with tracking chips embedded in the skin of their hands.
So do they have, like, the explodey chip?
I do not believe they have the explodey chips, at least.
That's nice.
So it's really
an
humane.
Improvement. This is incremental improvement upon the condition of the slave.
If you think about it, it's, like, almost not even slavery.
Yeah, okay, Ben Shapiro.
Circa, by default, considers any children born of its slaves as their legal property, and the kids get shipped too. The character Rahara Wick from the book Master and Apprentice was born into enslavement on Hosnian Prime, a core world planet on the Corellian Trade Spire, which is an essential galactic hyperroute. You might remember Hosnian Prime as the future capital of the New Republic government.
It gets blown up.
When Obi-Wan tells Rahara that there is no slavery on Hosnian Prime, her friend responds sarcastically, "Of course not. The Republic doesn't allow slavery. They do allow Circa Corporation to do business, though, and naturally Circa can bring in whatever workers it wants. If those workers are owned instead of paid, well, that's an internal corporate matter, isn't it? Nothing to do with the governments of the planet their sentient property is sent to work on. Circa operates with impunity in Republic space. Quoting again, they've made untold trillions over untold centuries, largely through slave labor. Circa maintains a presence on several major worlds on which it does business, such as Pyjal, where Circa was placed in control of its penal system. The corporation extends prison sentences into being mandatory for a long list of sometimes minor crimes, and many crimes become punishable by life sentences at labor.
American South moment right there.
Well, yeah, we We say that the United States made slavery illegal, but Amendment 13 of the U.S. Constitution allows for involuntary servitude as a sentence.
Neither prison nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime.
The legality of slavery via incarceration, and therefore via criminalization, exists widely in the United States of America and the UK. 7 states in the American South pay no wages at all to their incarcerated workforce, which labor on prison farms and in manufacturing centers. The conditions in these penal labor centers can't exactly be called good. OSHA doesn't have jurisdiction over inmates, and there's no injury or disability compensation. And if prisoners can provide unpaid labor, then there might be an incentive to imprison more people to meet quotas. Or there might be other ideological justifications given for the need for such labor. In a system that sentences a disproportionate number of black and brown people, boom, you did it. You're doing a scaled down version of racialized slavery. We'll come back to that racialization thing in a bit. This system of privatized entities and worldviews that benefit from increased criminalization is what we call the prison industrial complex. It's the thing that Narkina 5 from Andor is critiquing.
Does the company we're talking about here run the prisons on Narkina 5?
Not that I know of. That seems imperial. But I would really love if they said this is a company. I don't care if it's Circa, but I would be really interested in it being a private factor. I don't think it is, though. A place where I feel like Narkina 5 fails in Andor is because Andor is a human-centric drama.
There's no aliens.
There's no aliens. And I wish there had been a line or something that said, this is a human-only prison, because it definitely is. It definitely is. They segregate them.
Well, because the method of control you use is human-specific, right?
Yeah.
Because not every alien is going to be able to put their bare feet on the ground and be zapped by the thingamajigger.
Well, and the fiction of Narkina 5 is that you work your sentence and then you get out, right? I doubt it's that simple for alien prisons under the Empire. All of this is to say that what counts as criminal and what doesn't isn't as simple as breaking the letter of the law. And the law doesn't necessarily apply to everyone in the same ways. Watto owning Shmi Skywalker as a slave would be illegal in the Republic, but Circa's sentient property is just good business. Star Wars outlaw class certainly does not include everyone that breaks the law. If we're asking Sophie's best friend Max Weber, the law is essentially a set of rules with consequences meted out by the monopolized force of the state. But if it's selectively enforced, or not enforced at all, think about those like silly laws where it's against the law to let a donkey sleep in a bathtub in Arizona.
Fact, it is against the law in the city of Boise, where I grew up, to fish off the back of a camel.
Yeah, we have stuff that isn't enforced, probably.
I don't know. If I saw a guy fishing off the back of the camel,
he better fucking watch out.
You best believe I would narc on that bitch.
If those sorts of things exist, then rules with state consequences can't be the whole story. What is the law, then? We might say that it exists to prevent harm done to individuals, but when C-3PO can't legally translate writing on a Sith dagger because of 1,000-year-old senatorial legislation, is that really keeping anyone safe?
I do enjoy that moment of bureaucracy.
It is a great bit of little world building, I feel.
Like, he knows what it says, but he's not allowed to say it.
We know from the reign of the Empire that the law isn't built to express morality. Murder seems to be largely illegal. Sure, that's good. But Imperial law also enshrines its own totalitarian rule in its legal code. So criminality doesn't just include Han Solo smuggling illegal materials, but also the largely noble resistance effort of the entire alliance. And again, things happen despite not necessarily being legally sanctioned. Darth Vader seems to murder people all the time. Why doesn't it count for him? Because he's the military.
Because he's a cop.
Because he's a cop. We could adapt Frank Wilhoit's idea that there are in-groups whom the law protects but does not bind, and out-groups whom the law binds but does not protect. That's relevant and pretty spicy, but probably not the whole story. Legal theorist John Austin says, laws or rules, properly so called, are a species of commands. If you are able and willing to harm me, in case I comply not with your wish, the expression of your wish amounts to a command. But what then sets a non-law command apart from a law? If an invading military enters your homeland and tells you at gunpoint that they're in control now, is that the law? Should it be treated as such? It's starting to feel like the law is a pretty woolly concept. Much like all socially constructed phenomena, there are places where the law exists, doesn't exist, is intractable, shapes people's lives, is entirely vibes-based, and so on.
Yes. Good. This is all very solid theory of law stuff, yeah.
Yes, good. I good.
I good. Law good. Well, mostly.
Well, unsurprisingly, there is no legally accepted definition of the law because it's not about that.
Right. Well, it's the law is defined in the same way that the British Constitution is defined, in that they don't have one, and the British Constitution just consists of like every law the Parliament made before a certain time.
Really? I couldn't tell.
Also, Liz Truss killed Henry Kissinger, but that's a whole nother talk. Hey, she was spotted in Washington, D.C. like 2 days before the man died.
Was she?
Uh-huh.
I love Liz Truss. The Queen and then Kissinger.
Girl boss.
She's an icon.
Girl boss. Although I would have rather she killed Kissinger before the Queen, frankly.
Why not both at once?
Well, it's kind of hard to get them in the same room at this point.
No, they are in the same room. Because they're both burning in fucking hell.
Disclaimer, Eleanor does not believe in hell.
So, the law is bullshit. We're never going to be able to explain it. Who comprises the criminal class in Star Wars? Who does the law bind? We've got individual actors, pirates, thieves, assassins, but the biggest commonality is the connection to organized crime. Han Solo and Boba Fett do work for the Hutts, Babu Fricks with the Kijimi Spice Runners, Kira is owned and operates for Crimson Dawn.
Something I think is kind of interesting about the relationship of Han Solo to, like, being a criminal is that we don't see him as a criminal. Like, he's easily as much of a criminal as, like, Boba Fett or whoever else you want to say, but, like, our narrative lens of him is that he's, he breaks the law, but he does it because he's cool and awesome instead of those other people who do it because they're bad and evil.
3 things. 1, Han Solo is sometimes portrayed as breaking the law. It is usually displayed as noble, harmless fun. 2, Han Solo doesn't break the law that bad because he's fundamentally, within the Star Wars narrative, a good person who kind of thinks a lot of himself and pretends to be bad. Here we have these ideas of good and bad. He sure did. 3, there are ways in which Star Wars will occasionally, not really in canon anymore, but there are a couple of instances of Lucasfilm 10, 20 years ago trying to make sure that Han wasn't too bad in published works. There is an anecdote about essentially spice not being classed as a drug, and the person who was writing it was like, of course it's a fucking drug. And then they were like, well, no, we don't want him to seem bad. And they mailed George Lucas. And George Lucas replied, of course it's a fucking drug. Like, of course it's a drug.
Thanks, George Lucas.
Which, I mean, we'll get to that. But yes, Han Solo is a weird case. I agree. A crime syndicate is essentially a business. They typically function with intense hierarchy, lots of little guys on bottom and one big guy on top, and they operate as businesses. They take in money, labor, and resources and attempt to multiply them in order to continue operation and ensure a big payout for the people calling the shots. It just so happens that in these sorts of organized crime situations, the business isn't stuff you'd want to tell your mom about. The level of criminality at play here also isn't entirely clear. It's not like Jabba the Hutt has ever been charged for any crimes, not tax evasion.
I mean, if they're gonna get him.
Yeah, it's gotta happen somehow. A lot of the Hutt crime empire operates in Hutt space, which is an autonomous region of the galaxy on the border between the mid and outer rims. The political dynamic between the Republic and Hutt space is complicated. It varies event to event, planet to planet.
So effectively, the Hutts have created an area where crime is legal.
Kinda, yeah. But it's like, is that crime at that point?
Well, I mean, there are certain things that everyone would say is a crime regardless of the law, right? Murder, perhaps.
I would say it's bad, but I don't know if I'd say it's a crime.
But there's, like, the legal element of the law and the social aspect of the law, because a lot of what we consider to be the law is ultimately derived from what we socially consider to be bad.
There are social ideas about pro-social and antisocial behavior, and with that, moral and immoral actions. I, myself, would not call something a crime if I were not in a place without the law.
So if you go to that, 10-mile strip of Yellowstone that's in Idaho, where they can't assemble a jury and the law technically doesn't exist in the United States.
If someone killed someone there and I saw it, I would say, hey, what the hell? But I wouldn't say, stop, criminal, you violated the law. And maybe I'm just being too philosophically technical, but I do think that is a worthy distinction.
Yeah, I just think that saying they've created a place where crime is legal is quite funny.
It is one of those things that, defines itself out of existence. Slavery is not illegal in Hutt space, right? So to what degree is the Hutt cartel an actual criminal organization?
Oh, it's a crime against humanity in Hutt space still.
Yes.
If the space UN was...
Unlike the relationship between the Hutts and the Republic, the relationship between the Hutts and all the syndicates for that matter and the Empire is much clearer. For a lot of their time, the Empire enables the syndicates. In the comic Crimson Reign of the Hutts, Kira says, they enjoy protected status in their sector in exchange for performing valuable services for the Empire outside of the bonds of imperial law. This deal has been in place for decades. Imperial governors also work with members of other gangs, Crimson Dawn, Black Sun, the Pikes, to ensure mutual satisfaction, largely coming in the form of massive bribes for Imperial officials. When there is a slave uprising on Kessel that is under the jurisdiction of the Pikes, it's the Empire that sends a blockade to back them up. This is the Empire protecting the interests of its private clients? I don't know.
Spicy.
Yeah, it's like they say in Solo, it is a lawless time.
The Empire has made crime legal.
The value here is clear. Organized crime is about top-down power. So if you're an authoritarian state and you've got massive-ass syndicates, you don't try to police them all at the top. You make good with their head honchos, levying threats and responsibility in appropriate measure so that they control their people and their territories for you. It makes a lot of sense. During World War II, the United States literally cut a clandestine deal with the Italian, American, and Jewish mafias, codenamed Operation Underworld, in exchange for letting them take their cut at northeastern seaboard ports. The mob would turn over Axis spies, limit black market theft, and suppress wartime labor strikes.
All of those things, except the last thing, are quite based, I will say.
Yeah, I mean, for the record, it's not clear that it worked. Different people disagree.
That's disappointing, because I really do like the idea of the New York mob being like, "Hey, mister, you're a fucking German. I'm gonna break your kneecaps and give you to Uncle Sam. Fuck you."
A lot of the fear was Italians.
Can there be, like, one bad thing in American history that is not just racism?
There's
Yeah,
misogyny.
keep thinking. But, like, has that...
The shit that started Stonewall was racist. Yeah, we can't get away from
There is
it.
not, like, one thing.
Yeah.
Can we just, like, stop doing history in this country so we can stop having everything be caused by racism, please?
What's his name moment? I can't remember. Who's the history's ever guy?
End history. I'm no longer asking.
Yes, yeah. Okay.
He had some good ideas.
I get where he's coming from. I just don't fully agree with the
Well, I mean,
way he
to be
spells it
fair,
out.
like, Marx's theory is also kind of the end of history moment, so...
It's kind of also the end of history moment. The thing is about modernism is it kind of requires the belief in the end of history up till now. That history
and then everything
is
just
before
going
times.
to be extremely boring and
Yeah.
to the far future. Yeah,
This
which,
is-
to be fair, I don't mind.
A lie. Unfortunately, things will keep happening ad infinitum.
That's boring.
Additionally, if you're the Galactic Empire, imagine, you're the Galactic Empire, it makes a lot of sense to keep a... That's just in your brain. There's just like a little
just a
marching stormtrooper powering little cogs and
in my
wheels.
head, on a treadmill, like...
Yeah. But he's going pretty slow, so it's in time with the beat. Okay, you can use organized crime to justify your own military occupation. Let the civilians of the world grow scared of the alien gangsters doing their violent crime in the streets, so that when you march your stormtroopers in to introduce a bit of law and order, you can paint yourself as the hero.
This is like that time when Ronald Reagan's administration introduced crack to the United States. Which, to be completely clear, his administration introduced crack cocaine to the United States via the CIA.
We're getting there. If you're in this situation, you don't necessarily get rid of the people in charge of the violent crime. You want to keep those guys around, just in case you need to let them scare the civilians again. The Empire does try to cut into the Hutt business after Yavin, and eventually Vader kills all of the upper echelons besides Jabba. But that's not really the point that I want to talk about here. Let's move on.
They commit Hutt genocide.
Kinda. Certainly Hutt cartel genocide. He kills all of them except for Jabba. And then when Jabba goes down, that's all of them. That's why...
Bukele moment.
Yeah, that's why stuff's so messy in Book of Boba Fett. That the twins are showing up and that they are trying to reassert control over what was previously a Hutt territory is a big deal. What Star Wars organized crime syndicates actually do can vary. They perform all sorts of illicit functions, protection rackets, embezzlement, arms smuggling, whatever. Usually we're just introduced to organized crime in Star Wars as definitionally crime syndicates. And we aren't really told how they operate or what they do. But still, time and time again, Star Wars comes back to one major revenue source for these groups, particularly the Pike and Hutt syndicates. The harvest, manufacture, and proliferation of drugs. If this were an edited video podcast, this is the part where we'd see the words Daughter of Ferrix appear on screen, but with the FE replaced by the atomic symbol for iron, like it's Breaking Bad.
Yeah, this is the Daughters of Ferrix podcast.
That's why it's called Ferrix. It's because it's like
an iron planet.
Yeah, it's like a metal scrapyard. Yeah. Do you know about Stu John?
I don't.
So one time during an interview with Jon Stewart asks George Lucas, "What planet is Obi-Wan from?" And George Lucas looks around the room and says, "Stu John." That has been canon ever since it was said.
Stu John.
I hate George Lucas.
I love
George Lucas should be put down.
I love him so much.
He needs to be
more.
stopped.
Because if I was an eccentric billionaire in charge of one of the world's most popular media properties, I too would just come up with bullshit and force everyone to deal with it.
There is this tension in the portrayal of narcotic substances in Star Wars. We see them around, we even saw inside a spice processing lab in Obi-Wan Kenobi, but they're rarely given context or personalization. They're almost never used by protagonists. Most of the time, drug use is an aesthetic shorthand in the series, a way for us to view the seedy underbelly of Star Wars as inherently dangerous, vile, and those who take part in it as disposable.
Right, because drugs make a person lose all their worth.
This is, of course, a generalization. There have been dozens of narcotics introduced to Star Wars, particularly in Legends, and they do vary in their representation. But, for example, we rarely know why and how spice is illegal. Spice does have addictive qualities, and we know about specific strains that are really powerful and so illegal, but it can also be used for pain management by people who have chronic health issues. But if you live somewhere like Naboo where it's entirely criminalized...
So it's an opiate.
It's an opiate.
Good.
Well, it's also kind of weed.
Although weed is the gateway drug, so watch out for
Yeah,
that,
weed's
kid.
you do that, and then it's just...
Immediate, heroin.
You're eating...
Bender.
You're eating a brownie, and your crazy friend comes up and sticks you in the arm. You don't even know what it is. Could be fentanyl for all you know. Pushing like a powder out of... I know, that's the joke. That's the joke that I'm making, Sophia. Yeah, if you need it for medicine, you're shit out of luck. If you're on one of those worlds, you gotta go somewhere else. Drugs, spice, glitter stem, death sticks, you name it, in Star Wars seem to largely exist to be illegal. Not all of them are, but we as the audience are meant to infer why spice or death sticks are illegal, based on our own impressions of real-world substances. And unfortunately, those impressions aren't as accurate or untainted as we might like.
Everything is racism all the time.
Everything is racism all the time, always.
Trademark.
Let's get this out of the way. Engaging with illicit substances can be dangerous. I don't encourage any unsafe behaviors, but at the same time, no person who uses is automatically less valuable or especially worthy of punishment than anyone who doesn't.
Unless you're that really annoying stoner from Colorado who's like, ski and weed, bro.
Yeah,
then
in which
you're
case
less
your
valuable.
friends should give you a slap upside the
Ostracize
head
you,
and
yeah.
It's pretty damn normal to enjoy getting fucked up. It just is. Substance abuse can harm a person's life, some drugs far more than others, but let's be clear, so can a lot of shit that's perfectly legal and lacks anywhere near as much stigma. The demonization and criminalization of specific substance use is inextricable from the historical racism that surrounds it. So let's talk drug policy. In 1971, President Richard Montague Nixon, that's not his middle name, named drug abuse to be the United States public enemy number one. You know Nixon.
I really wish his middle name was Montague. I think that's very funny.
Richard McDonald's Nixon.
What is his actual middle name?
Richard Milhouse Nixon.
That's even funnier.
This kicks off...
I'm going to start calling him Millie exclusively.
Millie Nix, yeah.
Millie Nix.
This kicks off what the Nixon administration called the War on Drugs, which would prove to be one of, at least, the most harmful internal campaigns in American history. In 1973, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, was created, and for about a decade, the war was reasonably quiet. That changed when we got to Reagan.
I have another podcast, you may know this, and we have kind of a bit on that podcast where everything that's wrong with the country is because of Ronald Reagan, and every time I learn about more, I am more confirmed in my belief.
He was a bad guy. He was a bad guy who did bad things.
Bad shit.
He's down there with Kissinger and the Queen. The Reagan administration saw a wide expansion of focus on drug use. In 1984, he signed into law a system of mandatory sentences for drug offenders. Funding for the DEA was raised by almost 12 times. Apparently, White House officials recognized crystal meth as being largely the problem for poor white Americans, but the president's office was far more concerned with cocaine, particularly crystalline crack cocaine.
I couldn't possibly imagine why Ronald Reagan's White House would be concerned with crack cocaine, a type of cocaine that is predominantly used by African American individuals. I'm shocked and awed that they could possibly have focused on that instead of something that might have affected all races or white people equally.
Really putting the white in White House. The thing about cocaine in the 80s is that fucking everyone was doing it. But the white people, especially the rich white people, weren't doing crack, they were snorting powder.
Yeah.
Smoking crack was the domain of largely urban-centered black people, and it didn't get there by accident.
The CIA put it there as part of, like, there was this whole thing called the Iran-Contras scandal, if you know about it. And basically, Reagan wanted to fund this kind of right-wing terrorist uprising in Central America. And to do this, he had to do a whole exchange with Iran, who we were allegedly not friends with at the time.
Allegedly.
Allegedly not friends with at the time, that involved crack. What happened is they buy these drugs. They buy crack, they buy cocaine, they buy other things from these right-wing terrorists in Nicaragua who are trying to overthrow a sort of leftist-ish government. And then they use that money to buy weapons from Iran to then give to the terrorists, and they sell the drugs to Black Americans. And this is the CIA doing this.
I love America. My country.
I mean, I am somewhat impressed at the intricacy of this operation on the part of the CIA and the fact that they didn't get caught in time for anybody to get in trouble for it. But
the CIA needs to go outside, get laid. Come on. Bunch of losers. Bunch of war crimey losers. For over 20 years, the mandatory minimum sentence for possession of crack was 5 years. The classic example is 5 years in prison for possession of 5 grams of crack compared to 500 grams of powder for the same sentence.
This is the reason that they spouted, not like the actual reason. We know the actual reason is racism, but what they would always say is, well, crack is more dangerous than powder cocaine, which it is, and so it needs to carry a harsher penalty for possession.
I would still argue that is disproportionate, though.
Certainly.
And we are seeing the law not being doled out equally for all types of people. Let's go back in time. In the mid-1800s, anti-Asian sentiments were prolific. A huge Chinese population immigrated to the United States, both for the gold rush of the 1850s and
to build the railroads.
And to build the railroads in the 1860s. And white people fucking hated this. Partially because they saw them as like a threat to their jobs and stuff, and partially because they were racist. Usually both. The first one being fed by the second one. And with all that...
I wonder if there are any contemporary phenomena that are similar. When Donald Trump is reelected and makes immigration from Latin America illegal, this will just be like the Chinese Exclusion Act again.
To be fair, if it is from a country, it is not the same as the Chinese Exclusion Act, because the Chinese Exclusion Act did it on the basis of race.
But I think that the outcome is exactly the same.
Obviously.
They might have written it in like the 1800s as, we do not want the insert racial stereotype character of the Latin American people to drain the virility of our race.
We don't want, we are not going to allow anyone from this number of specifically like largely Islamic countries. Yeah. Fuck that shit,
man.
We
don't want them to deplete the virility of the white race so they can't be allowed into America.
With this racist fervor came this sensationalized picture of the opium den. The opium den was exotic, dangerous. It's a temple of satanic worship and a symbol. I read some shit about this, and it's very funny. It is a symbol of the true nature of the Chinese man. White medical writers pathologized this fear, saying that the threat of smoking opium was addiction, that when addicted, a white drug user would be reduced to the status of the Chinese man which he fears, which is, pretty powerful drug fear-mongering for racists. Just say no, but it's for the worst guy you know.
Just say no, otherwise you will become Chinese. There's nothing worse than becoming part of one of the largest and most interesting cultures on Earth. Yeah.
When I got done writing this section, I was like, I have to pivot back to Star Wars. I was like, fucking hell, this podcast is garbage.
We're almost halfway through. Look at us go.
Yeah, we're about halfway. Cultural historian Timothy A. Hickman referred to this line of thinking as a logic whose easy circularity was perhaps its most vicious feature. Narcotic addiction experts, who often argued that to be an addict was to be like the Chinese, further implied to be Chinese was to be like an addict.
I am a little broken on that one because I don't quite understand what the hell that's supposed to mean.
So the idea is of the Chinese man as degenerate.
Oh, so this is a racial character moment.
Yes, this is racism.
So the racial character of the Chinese man is such that he is a degenerate.
Right, he is degenerate.
He does not work.
He is hedonistic in the opium den, but also taking our jobs. And
the Mexican is lazy, but also taking our jobs.
This is like opium reduces the white man to
Good Lord.
Right. It's this type type of addiction brings you down to the inherently base status of a Chinese person. It's racism. It's racism, Sophie.
I would simply not do racism. That's what I would do. How do you assume that, like, oh, the base character of this entire 500 million at the time strong population is that they're, like, lazy or whatever? Yeah, let me just generalize half of the world's population as one thing and the other half is another thing.
Well, outgrew homogeneity bias, but also people like feeling superior to other people. People get scared of stuff they don't know. Another thing is just disgust. People are often off-put by stuff that they don't feel relates to them. Notably, opioids were used by white people back then. Of course they were. Many of them were even addicted, but white people took their opioids as pills or as a shot that your doctor gives you. Smoking opioids? That's for non-white people.
So smoking cocaine is for racial minorities. Huffing cocaine is for rich white people.
Precisely. We can see an arbitrary juxtaposition here. The acceptable drugs, stuff like alcohol or tobacco or even powder cocaine and pill form opioids, depending on, when we're talking about, versus whatever thing the black or brown or Asian people are doing. It's criminalization through vibes, almost. It's aesthetic. Drug policy reform advocate Deborah Peterson Small argues that because of the way in which U.S. drug policy was developed, there was always, for each drug, a specific racialized link.
Right, like meth is the poor white person's drug.
What?
Opioids is the middle class drug.
There is a very real...
Weed is from Hispanics, for Hispanics, and weird middle class white kids also.
Well, and hippies, the left. Medical historian David F. Musto notes that the Southerners' fear of the Negro and the Westerners' fear of the Chinese predominated America's approach to the drug problem. A prejudiced system doesn't have to be a literal conspiracy. Just because a legal system is racist doesn't mean that there is a shadowy group of ne'er-do-wells in a secret government office actively deciding how best to fuck over black people today.
That being said, there is often a shadowy ne'er-do-wells in the government actively deciding how to fuck over black people today.
People can uphold racist systems, even if they are personally non-racist or even anti-racist, by perpetuating harmful ideas and stereotypes that they may not even know they have. People operate constantly within systems that were built with explicit racist intentions. But Sophie's right, we've got both. We're talking about drug policy in the US. We have systems continuing that were designed to include or exclude based on race that are sometimes perpetuated largely in good faith. And then we've got absolute racists on all levels of the legal system, especially on top. In a famous quote to Harper's Magazine, Nixon advisor John Ehrlichman said the following: "In 1968, the Nixon White House had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." I will say, this is a popular one. It's a damning quote. The accuracy can be credibly questioned. For one, Nixon was definitely racist, but he also certainly hated drugs on a moral level. And the real racist crackdowns didn't happen until Reagan. But I think that Ehrlichman is naming a real phenomenon, even if it wasn't as planned as he says. The white public often does associate non-white people with illicit drugs. Maybe Nixon had a vendetta against drugs because he was racist, and maybe vice versa. The difference doesn't matter. This correlation in a modernizing America is literally over a century old. Drug offenses are now a massive cause of arrest in the US. 24% of people arrested for drug offenses are black, despite black people only being 13% of the population.
And we don't mean that in a racist way.
I think we've established why that probably is. 1 in 17 white men is statistically likely to spend time in prison in his life. For Hispanic men, it's 1 in 6. I've pretty much only talked about the US here, but the war on drugs became a semi-global campaign, and it's had consequences elsewhere too. A black British person is 7 times more likely to be stopped and searched than a white one. The UK's stop and search law is politically justified by the supposed threat of knife crime. However, in the last 4 years, the reason given for 2/3 of stop and searches is drugs.
There's this guy on TikTok I watch who drives Uber in Australia, and he's Arabic, and he gets stopped like every freaking night for no reason, and the cops might not even know that they're pulling him over because he's brown, which is the bad part of how embedded racism is in society.
We'll get to that.
Because they're like, oh, well, that guy just looks suspicious. They might not even be thinking, like, he's Arabic, therefore he's doing drugs. They could be not thinking that and still be doing racism, not on purpose, because of how racist society is. That's not good, man.
We'll get there.
I mean, some of them probably are pulling him over because they're racist, but...
That happens too. It needs be reminded. People of all races seem to consistently use illegal drugs at comparable rates. There is no correct egalitarian way to justify this level of disparity. This is just discrimination. In the US, the police have become more and more militarized to suit this war. In the early days, many police precincts in the South started using higher caliber bullets in their guns because they believed the racist myth that a black man high on crack was harder to take down. Did you ever hear that stuff at school?
I
did.
actually heard that at school.
It's bad. In the early 80s, the vice president's office pushed for the involvement of the CIA and US military in drug prohibition. Talk about Foucault's boomerang. But it's the CIA. So they're dropping crack cocaine as it spins around. Okay, moving on. Meanwhile, fatal overdoses increased over 6 times from 2001 to 2018. $3.3 billion of taxpayer money was sent to the DEA in 2021. 70% of US adults think that weed should be legalized for recreational use. The war on drugs has been costly, it doesn't work, it's unpopular, and it's fucking racist. When a black man is extrajudicially killed by the police, we hear the excuse that he was no angel. And more often than not, the talking heads are desperate to justify that killing on the basis of typically unrelated drug use. After the murder of George Floyd, then Alabama Congressman Mo Brooks criticized the press backlash against Floyd's killing for deifying a druggie and a thug. Mo Brooks might as well be one of those guys 100 years ago fear-mongering about Negro cocaine fiends.
Just so everyone is clear, even if he was doing drugs, in the United States of America, where in those jurisdictions that have the death penalty, nowhere does doing drugs carry the death penalty. So, I don't quite see how even in, their psychotic legalist framework that would change anything.
Right, you shouldn't have to be an angel not to get shot by the cops in your bed. Racism. In his article, Symbolism and Racism in Drug History and Policy, Desmond Manderson sums it up nicely. It was not opium as a substance that concerned the community, but rather opium as a symbol of transgression that the Chinese presence had elicited. Opium was prohibited because it represented an amalgam of race, sex, and fear. In the United States and all around the world, the role of drugs as a metonym for all manner of social ills is of continuing significance. This is the cultural soup that Star Wars is born from. Okay, everyone pause, take a breath. This one's been heavy. Unfortunately, even with drug portrayals aside, presenting the people who do crime as something of a racialized other is also not something Star Wars has avoided. There are humans in the cantina scene in A New Hope, but very few feature in the close-ups. Instead, the camera tells us that this place is filled with weird and wild aliens.
Bringing it back to drugs for a moment, we also see them, smoking weird things.
There's a hookah and stuff. Yeah, but we see a bat person, we see a Yeti person. We do get lines from Dr. Evazan, who's a human, but he's a half-blind man with a facial deformity. This is the only time in the movie we see anywhere near such a diversity of bodies. The Rebel Alliance in A New Hope is, aside from Chewie, people forget this, entirely human.
Which we know isn't accurate because...
Right, we can understand in retrospect the Rebel Alliance as this relatively multicultural institution, but our main characters are always human. That is a result of us being humans and we want to see human stories. But as it is presented in Star Wars, aliens are an underclass. And remember how Obi-Wan describes the people in the one place where we see non-humans, he calls them scum. Chris Kemshaw cites the planet of hats trope with regards to the way aliens are represented in Star Wars. It's that thing where the heroes go to a new place and all the people who live there are like, well, howdy, this is the planet of hats where we all wear hats. And the culture, the political landscape, the people are essentially homogenous.
This is quite funny because I was watching Rick and Morty and they go to just the Purge planet, the Snake planet, or in Star Trek there's always one. Every planet except Earth has a shtick. The Romulan planet is the racism planet of Star Trek.
The planet of hats trope is a tidy way to do science fiction. A single planet with billions of people would realistically have a tremendous amount of culture, history, variation, and that's not even to mention what differences could occur if there are abiding physiological differences from humans. On our real world, there are around 200 sovereign nations, but besides the odd civil war, Star Wars tends to treat its worlds as singular monocultural political entities. Star Wars has the ice planet, or the forest moon, and we're meant to immediately understand what that is and what that means in our very first introduction to it.
If you look at globalization theory, there is the idea that before you get to that stage of technology, you would kind of have to be a monoculture as a planet, but that's not necessarily going to occur.
Right, and in Star Wars, it is a story device, but it's got its shortcomings. Rhodians are an alien species of green-skinned, bug-eyed bipeds, introduced to us when we see the bounty hunter Greedo in A New Hope. Kemshal describes the way that in Legends, nearly all Rhodians are presented to the readership as bounty hunters like Greedo. The same has often been true for Mandalorians. We saw Boba Fett, he was cool, and despite them having some culture retconned in, they are constantly given mercenary roles in the series. A lot of Star Wars fans just want to keep seeing dudes like Boba Fett, Mandalorians with cool armor hunting bounties. That's why the Mandalorian exists, right?
The racial character of the Rhodian is such that he is a bounty hunter.
The racial character of the Rhodian is such that he is a bounty hunter. The racial character of the Mandalorian is such that he is a mercenary. The racial characteristic of
the human is such that he can do whatever he wants, apparently.
Right. Human characters in Star Wars get to be presented as diverse, as multicultural, and they fulfill all sorts of roles. But non-humans typically don't have this luxury. In universe, we're told...
The freaking racial character of the Mon Cala is that they drive spaceships. Big spaceships.
Kinda, yeah. Yeah, that's a good one. I don't think about, like, character roles as much, but yeah. In universe, we're told that monocultural view of aliens and planets is a human prejudice, but while that's kind of funny, it's a cop-out. It excuses the way in which non-humans are genuinely presented in Star Wars. We don't have the time here to delve into the exact ways in which race is a fiction we tell ourselves, but if a person who looks like me, Caucasian with light hair, is in Star Wars, she counts as human. And what's the utility between distinction of pale blonde humans from, say, Umbarans, which is a species classed near human whose varied trait is pretty much just purplish white skin and white hair? Why is there a stark social divide between humans and the blue Pantorans, or humans and the multicolored Mirialans?
Or the Chiss, who are basically just humans with blue skin.
Exactly. We are talking about differences of pigment here. Why aren't they included in the Empire's humanocentric rule? Star Wars has a habit of showing us alien characters that are so often, due to the fact of their non-humanness, relegated to criminality. But what's worse is that the ways in which criminal aliens are portrayed aren't always just problematic in universe, but outside of it too.
Yeah, a lot of them kind of mirror the ways that we do racial stereotypes.
Star Wars is built on tropes, and we always have to remember those tropes come from a culture with certain ideas of crime. In Return of the Jedi, viewers are finally introduced to Jabba the Zilligic Tirre. I've never heard that name spoken aloud.
It's a cool name.
We're introduced to Jabba, the crime boss Han has been talking about for like 4 years. And whew, we are introduced. Half an hour of Jedi is spent rescuing Han Solo's frozen ass from Jabba's wall. It's a quarter of the film. Jabba, as we see him, is a 12-foot-long alien creature with green leathery skin, a massive belly, and no neck. He smokes a hookah, he eats living frogs whole, and makes the sound of melted cheese anytime he moves. He holds court in a large sandstone room filled with smoke, lively music, and his retinue hanging around, joining him in the partaking of whatever illicit substances are on hand, I'm sure. In his book, The Empire Triumphant, Kevin Wetmore critiques the trappings of Jabba's rule. Jabba is described in the screenplay of Jedi as a repulsively fat, sultan-like monster. It is this term, sultan-like, that indicates the echo which Jedi is aiming for and indicates that Jabba should be read as part of the history of cinematic Arabs. Jabba is vicious. He metes out his rule through the threat of exotic creatures. He's gluttonous and rules over beings that the screenplay describes as smelly monsters listening to exotic instruments. Jabba is hedonistic, like the sheiks of films that use brown people from the Middle East as a racist shorthand for the enemy. In his book Cruel and Unusual, cultural anthropologist Lawrence Michalak asserts that there's a history in American film of portraying Arabs as villains who abduct white women to serve as sex slaves. This early Hollywood fantasy occurs in such films as 1921's The Sheik, 1924's A Cafe in Cairo, so forth.
And also in Return of the Jedi, where Leia is kidnapped and turned into a sort of sex slave.
Right. And the thing is, I called it a fantasy. It is a fantasy. Because at the same time as we're seeing the brown people are sexual predators trope, we're also getting to leer at the women being sexualized. The presumably straight white men that the film is made for get to have their cake and eat it too. They get to look down on and condemn Middle Eastern people and stare at Carrie Fisher's bikini-clad body. Remember that the slave Leia scene is the first time that Leia is truly sexualized in those films. The only time. Up till then, she's been portrayed in floor-length dresses, winter gear, etc. Return of the Jedi is giving its audience permission to look at Leia, to objectify her, because it was initiated by the bad people. It was those people who opened up the door. I might argue that Attack of the Clones using Padme's violent imprisonment by the Trade Federation as an excuse to show off her midriff is also partially resting on this trope. Remember that the Trade Federation is largely comprised of an alien species, Nemoidians, whose portrayals have been widely criticized as perpetuating some real anti-Asian tropes. Kevin Wetmore summarizes the scenes with Jabba, saying, "The entire opening sequence of Jedi is an echo of desert adventure films in which the white woman must be rescued from the lusty and violent Arab ruler. Every trope is present. Leia is sexualized, elevating the threat. Furthermore, the film denies the larger issues of ethics. The film leaves unquestioned the assumption of the rightness of the rescue of Han and the deaths, murders, of Jabba and those on the sail barge." And yeah, I mean, I'm not exactly on Jabba's side, but Han owes Jabba money. Han jettisoned a shipment of spice that was Jabba's property. Han had the money multiple times, and it's been like 4 years. And fuck Jabba or whatever, seize the means of production, I don't care. But like, they almost killed Max Rebo and his band. Droopy McCool, Cy Snoodles.
The guy who eats through his fingers.
Again, to quote Wetmore, what crime have those on the sail barge committed that earns them the death sentence, other than the guilt by association of being with Jabba and that they are different? Aliens. Jabba is a racially different, inferior enemy, surrounded by other racially different, inferior beings, which is what makes it acceptable to kill them all and enjoy the spectacle of it. Indeed, Star Wars, like a lot of our culture, often tells us that the people who are criminals look different and the people who are different are criminals and are disposable. You can shoot them, stab them, dismember them, cut them in half, explode them without any narrative moral consequences. Sex work is also something we occasionally see portrayed, sparsely in canon but more often in legends. But it too is meant to show us that this setting is seedy and unsavory because it features sex work. It is prejudiced against sex workers to exclusively feature them as underbelly backdrop, as moving in tandem with violent crime, when it just isn't that simple. And if we view criminals in Star Wars as disposable, that reinforces some of the most harmful beliefs our culture has about the people, especially the women, who do sex work. The disposability of criminals is also a method by which Star Wars enjoys another of its fun little action tropes, bounty hunters. The commonality of bounty hunters in Star Wars is, like the Mandalorians, nearly entirely down to how people felt about the group of hunters seen in The Empire Strikes Back. IG-88, Bosk, 4-LOM, Zuckuss, Boba Fett, and Dengar, only the latter is recognizably human. All of them have these sick-ass designs and imply a world of weird, cool action figure guys doing weird, cool anti-hero things. Bounty hunting is, in fact, often not illegal in Star Wars. The Bounty Hunters Guild is a largely democratic workers' organization that serves to regulate bounty hunting and basically keep it legal and above board. Not every hunter is in the guild, but it seems like most of them are. But we often see bounty hunters themselves use tactics that are, if not illegal, then somewhat questionable. And the people they're hunting for aren't always above board themselves. The hunters often act to reinforce the systems of power that dudes like Jabba or the Pikes benefit from. Bounty hunters sometimes act as a means by which we can indulge in Star Wars underworld through the lens of a badass we can root for. One that can be an anti-hero and disintegrate some guys, but is still just doing their job, and therefore morally superior to the bail skippers, debtors, and other people they're chasing. At worst, bounty hunters are hired muscle meant to reinforce the power of those with money to pay them. At best, they're basically cops. Actually, swap those. Being a cop is way worse. Jabba isn't just characterized by Middle Eastern tropes. His status in the Hutt clan is also inspired by ideas about the Italian-American and Sicilian mafias. And remember, Italians haven't always been classed as white in America. In Italy, darker-skinned Southerners, especially Sicilians, have been considered by Northern Italians as racially inferior. It was only last century that Italians in the States started to be categorically lumped in with whites instead of with black people. And obviously, it isn't just Jabba. Black Sun, the syndicate ruled by Prince Shizor, the main antagonist of the N64 game Shadows of the Empire, bears some similarity to cultural ideas about East Asian organized crime. A veneer of respectability, deep connections to legitimate businesses. Hell, the leader of Black Sun in the Clone Wars has a Fu Manchu mustache and a headdress that looks like a goddamn shunmage, which is just like a top knot hair. Watto in The Phantom Menace is
a Jew.
He's been painted a lot by commentators as an anti-Semitic stereotype via his hooked nose and closed-fistedness, described by reviewer Gilbert Adair as having come straight from the Nazis' anti-Semitic stock barrel. But John Leo argues that Watto is a conventional crooked Middle Eastern merchant. Jewish if you want him to be, Arab if you don't. Nice job, Watto. Remember that a lot of the time in Star Wars, criminals don't speak basic. They don't speak English. Ponda Baba's dialogue in the cantina is translated by his human friend. Greedo and Jabba both get lines spoken in Huttese, subtitled for the audience. Our main characters speak English almost exclusively, and typically do even when addressing non-English speaking characters. Political enemies also typically exclusively speak basic, except for the Separatists, which are largely non-human. A lot of the alien criminals are given non-English language dialogue to make them seem foreign and other. It's not just the aliens, even. When Han's ship is boarded by members of two different gangs that he both owes money to in The Force Awakens, Han is a bad guy. Like, an asshole. He's not a bad guy, he's just kind of a dick. He speaks basic with them. Balatik, the representative of the Guavian Death Gang, replies back in basic. Tasu Leech, on behalf of Kanji Club, exclusively speaks in Jablogian. I know, Jablogian. Try it, say it.
Jablogian.
It feels good. There are lore reasons for this in the visual dictionary. That's not important. That doesn't fucking matter to our point. Balatik is played by Brian Vernal and is the only unmasked member of the Guavian Death Gang. Vernal is a white Scottish man. Tasu Leech is portrayed by Yayan Ruhian, a brown-skinned Indonesian actor. The four other Kanji Club characters we see in the scene are all played by dark-skinned Indonesian or otherwise Asian performers. None of Kanji Club gets to speak English.
That's really bad, actually. That's just bad.
When it's retroactively revealed in episode 9 that Poe Dameron used to run Spice on Kajini, a lot of fans were pissed to see the first Hispanic person cast as a main character in a Star Wars film reduced to what they understandably see as a racist drug-running stereotype. There are ways in which Star Wars, particularly the 3 trilogies of films, endorses and teaches us to understand a worldview in which the good people are complex and varied and justified, and the bad or questionable people are, yeah, fascist, that's good, but also criminals, users, and non-humans, themselves coded as non-white. Star Wars aliens are silly little creatures and stuff, but they are also, in the narrative, sentient beings. And if we use Star Wars as a lens through which to view the world, as all experienced art inevitably becomes, what do we learn? What are we supposed to understand from a world in which dirty drug use and criminality is racialized, and vice versa, where everyone in a shitty, sandy bar gets grouped in as villains? Some Star Wars seems to argue, at least aesthetically, that those people on the bottom are there because they are bad, unworthy, disposable, or just kind of slimy and gross. In a fun way, of course, it's Star Wars, it's haha goofy time, but still, in the real world, antisocial behavior, unhealthy drug use, and criminality tends to have far more to do with, like, poverty and a lack of social services and lead in the paint. Environmental factors make a massive difference on a societal level. This is provable. And that does occasionally make it into the text of Star Wars. Han and Kira fall into their respective lives outside the law because they're orphans. They both get involved with a local gang to survive, and Kira gets trafficked, and she does what she can to just keep going. Those Kanji Club dudes I mentioned formed a gang to break free of their enslavement by the Hutts. Death stick addiction is explained in the visual dictionary as being an appealing alternative to the misfortune and poverty of the Coruscanti underworld. Max Rebo takes the job to play for Jabba, not because he's some hardened ruffian, but because it's fucking hard getting ahead in the music industry, and you'll take what paying gigs you can. Does he deserve to almost explode in a sail barge for that? Probably not. Max is a cool dude. Leave him alone. Get a job.
I would like there to not be racism in Star Wars, please.
Agreed. We spoke last episode about the idea of consent of the governed. Man is born free, and a government can only be considered legitimate if people agree to it.
But not women.
It's a fluffed-up version of the social contract. The idea that society, or the state, or morality, depending on who you ask, is formed when people agree to give up certain freedoms that existed in the state of nature, in exchange for the benefits we all get from living in a society. You can't go stab the guy who called you a loser for playing a Star Wars miniatures tabletop game, but in return, you get a legal structure with which you can attempt to sue that guy for everything he's worth.
Reliable for calling you a loser.
For calling me a loser. But we've talked so much today about how badly the Republic, the galaxy, and way more importantly, our society has failed entire categories of people. How can that happen? How can systems of laws and culture be so fucked that they essentially prey on some of the people they should be designed to protect? In the book The Racial Contract, Jamaican philosopher Charles W. Mills gives us an answer. He says that the idea of the social contract, as it's presented to us, is a lie that conceals a deeper truth. Let's recall the American Declaration of Independence. We talked about the ways in which it proclaims freedom for white men, specifically, as an aberrance, as an exception to this idealized rule of liberty. Mills argued that, essentially, the way that non-white people are left out of the contract making is by design. He said that what has usually been taken as the racist exception has really been the rule. What has been taken as the rule has really been the exception. This is in reference to, liberalism. Liberty. According to Mills, proclamations of the equal rights, autonomy, and freedom for all men are lies that conceal massacre, expropriation, and subjection to hereditary slavery. In this framing, there's a social contract as agreed upon for the state and for the society for and by white people, and buried in the fine print is the racial contract, the rules by which white people assert and maintain their ideals of white supremacy, and with which they hold power over people of color. In this view, the ways in which historical actors classed some people as subhuman is baked into key political developments and the law which springs out of them. What kind of political world do you create when you view some people as naturally suited for exploitation, as incapable of forming or fully entering into a body politic? John Locke may have talked about natural rights, but he also, incorrectly, saw indigenous people in the Americas as having no society or property, and that therefore it was morally justified to take their land. Like non-human animals, the indigenous people were seen not as autonomous beings with inherent rights as they were, but as essentially existing for the benefit of the white people who would exploit them. Abigail Thorne describes race as an economic and sociopolitical construct that determines people's access to resources. She says that racism and similar bigotries aim to justify making access to resources precarious. The racial contract comes with some economic and social benefits for the people that made it. When we take people who are poor or black or trans and categorize them into people that are considered violent and dangerous, then we can justify doing whatever we want to them. It's a tool. We can use them as scapegoats. We can imprison them, legislate away their rights, deport them. There might be an economic benefit to that. The prison industrial complex is a hell of a drug. Or there might be a social one. It feels good to blame someone you see as inferior for the problems of your society. Politics centered around a fear of criminals can be very emotionally powerful, and they hold a lot of sway in our society today. I recommend keeping an ear out for that sort of talk when listening to politicians discuss governmental policy. Crime is a very powerful buzzword.
If you watch or listen to right-wing or, even certain center-left sort of media sources, when they talk about a lot of cities like Chicago or St. Louis or Detroit that are plurality, not white, there's this kind of narrative that takes hold where suddenly it's very dangerous. No one in their right mind has ever had a fear of going to, San Jose. But if you go, 10 miles north into Oakland, then every white person shits their pants because they've been told by the media forever that place is dangerous because of crime. And by what they mean by crime is just black people mostly. It's crazy because the real dangerous places in this country are, majority white small towns in Nebraska. The places where you will actually get murdered are those places if you're a white person.
But the thing is, people talking about crime and cities and stuff like that aren't always doing it to be racist. That's not what it's about.
It's not even intentional a lot of times because I have this friend from childhood who I grew up with who is extremely not white. But when I mention just Chicago offhand, he's like, oh, Chicago's a war zone.
Oof.
And it's just kind of become ingrained in our society to think of places with a lot of non-white people or immigrants in them as inherently more dangerous than places where white people are. And when the reality is the types of violence that occur are mostly just different.
I said earlier that the racial contract was hidden in the fine print of the social contract. But here's the thing. It's not hidden for Asian American people who face blatant racism because of the coronavirus pandemic. It's not hidden from the black kids who have to get a talking to from their dad about how not to get shot by the cops. It's not hidden from indigenous Americans who live in a country that was built on land stolen from their ancestors, or Latinos that hear people like them talked about on television like they're an invading plague. The racial contract is hidden from very lucky people like me, the people whom that contract is written to protect, but not to bind. There are a lot of government officials who essentially ignore the discriminatory nature of the war on drugs, sometimes because they're racist, but also sometimes because they've bought so far into the story and into their role in it. You can learn better, but it's not exactly easy. Charles Mills figured that we could improve society by essentially including more and more types of people in the contract. Some people might say that it's impossible to do that on the scale necessary to actually fix it, or that when the contract has already been written, it's basically impossible to fully include anyone in it retroactively. But we probably should try to live in a system where we all consent to how it functions.
What you want to do when you're writing this hypothetical social contract is to not exclude people for stupid reasons, like race or gender, sexuality, etc.
transgenderism.
Exclude people for good reasons, like being libertarian or Baptist.
All right. I have a couple of caveats here at the end. I make a comparison in this episode between non-humans in Star Wars and people of color in our real world. This is meant to harness the idea of applicability, not allegory. If we take this comparison too far, it gets very problematic very fast. There are real physiological differences between a human and a Deveronian.
There are not real physiological differences between a white person and a
Black
black
people
person.
are the fucking same. Essential to understand when we're talking about race politics.
It's just pigment, guys. And if there is an Ubermensch, it's literally like the Nepalese because they can breathe better than the rest of us. Like, come on.
Well, and aliens might be discriminated against in Star Wars, but that's a fictional goddamn story, and millions of non-white people are harmed across the world constantly by systems that are built to marginalize them. Those things aren't comparable. I hope I've made it clear that I'm comparing the two largely as a way to show that the non-human quote-unquote criminal portrayals in Star Wars themselves reinforce cultural methods by which non-white people are criminalized and dehumanized. Additionally, I was pretty hard on these movies, but I firmly believe that it's both possible and necessary to critique aspects of a work of media while still finding value and enjoyment in it. I love Star Wars. I just do. I made this podcast about it, but I care more about the ways in which non-white people are harmed by the world in which we live. Star Wars is pretend. Real stuff always matters more. The fun thing about this show is that we always get to try to talk about one through the lens of the other. All right, we're going to talk about an email. We've got more than just the one, but this episode's going long.
The other ones have been put in the Email Bank of America.
I keep my emails under my mattress where they stay valuable.
Okay, Grandma.
We're going to read an email from Jacob Crouch. Jacob writes, "Hi, my name is Jacob. I recently discovered Daughters of Ferrix from Twitter and really love Star Wars politics. It also helps that I'm queer myself, so it really makes me feel seen to see other Star Wars fans like me." Thank you, Jacob. I really appreciate that. "I immediately knew I would like this podcast when I heard the ContraPoints references." Oof. Guilty.
Yikes.
Guilty. I am a known Natalie Wynn enjoyer and Patreon supporter, actually.
I used to be. I don't watch it so much anymore. But also, she posts a lot less than she used to.
That's why I follow her on Patreon. And also the fact that you take the speculative fiction elements of Star Wars seriously instead of calling it a space fantasy and writing it off. I will say, Jacob, it is a space fantasy. We're just losers on this pod. It is fantasy, but sometimes it's fantasy that does weird stuff. Never have I listened to a political podcast that actually made me want to read the book's reference. You too rock.
I'm proud to have made another Max Weber stan on this episode, and I would like to challenge them to read Max Weber because he is our king, whom we stan.
What Max Weber do you recommend that Jacob read?
I don't know any of it. It's all good, really.
Great.
And
Good prescription.
And frankly, I'm too sick at the moment to think of any names, so...
I'll leave you with a question. If you were Force sensitive, what kind of Jedi would you be? And what is your lightsaber color?
I would be the librarian.
Yeah?
I would be the
You
librarian.
fucking understudy Jocasta Nu?
Yeah.
That is an awesome choice. That is ace.
I don't fight, so...
What lightsaber color?
Something basic, like blue or green, probably.
My lightsaber color would probably be like blue. My favorite lightsaber color in story materials is white. But in video games, if it's an option, I will always play with a pink lightsaber. Do with that what you will. I think I would probably be a Jedi Wayseeker. I really like the Jedi. I think part of me is like, it would be really cool to be a Jedi. But I also know that if I were raised in the Jedi, I would hate the Jedi. And I would want to further the Jedi idea, but not have to work with the Council.
The moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. The moral arc of Ellie bends towards anti-authoritarianism.
Yeah. And... thank you very much for the question, Jacob. I really appreciate you mailing in. We'll get to other emails that we have in our inbox next time. Thank you for listening if you got this far. If you liked it, review us on places where you can review us. If you want to participate in the ongoing conversation, or if you have any questions, suggestions, or corrections, you can send them to our show email, daughtersferrix@gmail.com.
If you want to listen to new episodes as they release, you can find us most places you can listen to podcasts on our website, daughtersofferrix.com, or follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at FerrixPod, FerrixPod.
I have been Eleanor Mueller. You can find me at The Letter Bomber on most platforms. And Sophie, where can our lovely listeners find you?
You can find me at Sophia and SLC on Twitter. My other podcast, for the fifth time, yeah. My other podcast, The Redline Podcast, at @TheRedline_pod.
Our episodes are written and edited by me, Eleanor Mueller, and Sophia Dunstan. Our podcast art is by Jill Mueller. Our intro and outro music was arranged by me, with themes by Nicholas Bertel and John Williams. Thanks for listening.
Don't be racist, and if you become a Hutt, you can make crime legal.